Thank you so much for joining us for our book club. So excited to talk about this book. Please complete the poll. We will do a pre-poll before the webinar and one after. And we use that information to keep offering you webinars and book clubs and all kinds of things. Tonight, we're going to talk about The Big Letdown, which is a book by Kimberly Seals-Allairs. And the title is The Big Letdown, How Medicine, Big Business, and Feminism Undermine Breastfeeding. We do recommend reading the book, but you can participate in the book club without reading the book, because we're going to talk about the themes that the book brings out. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or to put it in the chat. And let us begin. So as we start out every time, just a little information about the Parent Information Center. We are now 40 years old, and our mission is to advance effective parent engagement throughout life and for all children to fulfill their potential to succeed. So we do this in lots of ways: learning opportunities such as this one, online resources like our website, outreach, and systems advocacy. We have many different programs. Please visit our website at pickofdell.org and see the different things that we offer to families and community members. So please go into the chat and introduce yourself and just let me know, why you're interested in breastfeeding or the topic, the conversation of breastfeeding. So what was your expectation for the book? So before you started reading it, if you did read it, or before you came tonight, what did you think we were going to be discussing from this book, The Big Letdown? And you can raise your hand, or you can just unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat. What were your expectations for this book? Miss C?
I got some things that I expected and got some things that I didn't expect. What I did expect is the history behind manufacturers, hospitals, doctors, and all the other factors in our society that encourage women not to breastfeed. Like, I knew that. I kind of did my own research as a layman, before I had my first child, and during the times when my children were little, I would talk to my mom, and she said that they heavily pressed for formula in the 70s. And they gave like the outlook on breast milk was like, oh, that old thing, like, like we're going to be more sophisticated and do the right thing by giving children formula, and people eating TV dinners and drinking high C, all this drinks with colors in it and all this type of manufactured thing. So it just went on down to the babies as well. And but what I didn't know is like the data behind the whole corporations and everything behind behind formula. So that's what I got from the book.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, I was very surprised about that as well, about the whole chapter talking about Twilight's birth and how that was preferred and how that helped the switch to birth from a physiological process to a medicalized process. That was fascinating, and I definitely want to explore that more. Shamir put in the chat breastfeeding issues or how you're set up to fail. Exactly. Any other things that you were expecting when you read this book?
I didn't expect the author to push for the acceptance that that breastfeeding is natural, not natural in terms of like, yes, we know that's something that the breast can do because of the mammary glands, and that's what human beings have been doing since they've been on Earth. But like, she really is an advocate for pushing that this is the way that children should be fed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was surprised about that. I'm happy about it. I support it, and to me, it's revolutionary because, like she said in the book, we're okay with sexualizing the breast, but now women, so-called modern women in a modern advanced country, have to fight for the legitimization of breastfeeding. I'm like, I'm just through with it, really.
Yeah. Erica put in the comment, I'm interested in this particular book club topic as I want to ensure I'm educated to inform my clients. I'm interested in hearing about how to handle breastfeeding on mental standpoint and how moms can cope and be supported during this journey. And this book talks a lot about that and the lack of support for moms, in particular for Black moms. But she starts the book out with her own account of crying in front of a door where her breastfeeding support group happens because she was feeling like she was failing at breastfeeding, and how this is common, and how, as Shamir put, we're set up to fail in this system. And she talks about all the different ways that is true. So, one of the things she has in the book, which I think goes to what Ms. C was saying, is if breastfeeding is natural and best, then why is it so difficult? And why do you think that breastfeeding is so difficult for American women in particular? Bye. So Erica says lack of education.
Well, you can't tell women to go to work and also, I guess, stay home. You can't do both things, and then it's hard to breastfeed children that you can't bring to work. So, I mean, why would they put your breastfeeding when it's not conducive to what they really want us to do, is be outside the home?
Yeah. Shamir said lack of support. And yes, that's support in lots of, systemic support in the family. So she also talks about different cultural supports and lacking, and why that is. Right. And so it's also not all about the actual physical experience, but what does she talk about that also makes breastfeeding difficult? Shamir says everyone wants what comes easy and quickly. Yes. But then also there's a real lack of psychological support, right? Emotional support. She talked in her experience and in those she's interviewed, where if there was any tiny challenge there, what are you immediately told? you're immediately told to give formula. Exactly. So there's no like, let's work this out, let's figure out what's going on. And she did the example of a woman, I believe that the one woman was in Europe, and then the one was here in the US. And the one in the US had some challenge and was told to give formula, which they ultimately did. And the one in Europe had a breast that did not produce milk, and was told, was encouraged to formula feed and said, no, I'm not going to do that. Got support from her breastfeeding support group, and ultimately ended up breastfeeding 2 babies with 1 breast. And so, the difference there was the support that the mother was able to access. So here is a graphic from the CDC. It's the percentage of the babies in the US that were ever breastfed and exclusively breastfed through 6 months. And so we see these numbers here. We have at the top the ever breastfed. So those that were breastfed and then were bottle fed, or were both breast and bottle fed. And then at the bottom, those who were exclusively breastfed. And you see these numbers are very low compared to other countries. They are some of the lowest. And the reasons are, as we talked about. And the numbers are not increasing significantly. From 2007 to 2022, went from 11.3 to 24.9. So in the book, she says the breastfeeding narrative, both historical and present day, is a cautionary tale about maternal bodies, good or bad mothers, and how our bodies are measured and assessed. What does she mean by that?
Maybe because you like determine the success, like whether you're successful or not with breastfeeding. Like a lot of people look at it as being a good or bad mom, and whether your body is sufficient if you can produce or not produce. Like it's measured basically on that, and you're judged whether you can do it well or not do it well.
Yes, exactly. What defined you as a good or a bad mom in terms of your body? Whether you can, I think it starts even in utero, right? Whether you can have a baby vaginally or you have to have a C-section. And then whether you can breastfeed or not. And then what is judged? She talks about it in the book. What is judged after you start breastfeeding?
How your breasts look.
Well, yes, but no, how much weight your baby is gaining.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
Right? If your baby is gaining weight quickly enough. And so she talks in the book, there's a whole section about the charts that were used to determine if babies were above average, average, or below average in terms of weight, and how those charts were based on formula-fed babies. So you are comparing breastfed babies and their weight gains and their Hi, guys. I have no idea what happened. My computer just froze. So, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Oh,
you.
good, good, good. Okay, hold on just a second. Oh, my. Okay, so yes, the slide was talking about the charts that are used to gauge growth, child growth, is based on outdated sample of babies who aren't breastfed. So until 2006, this was the standard growth chart in the US, and it was based on a sample of formula-fed infants. As a result, many breastfed infants were misdiagnosed with a failure to thrive and given formula based on these growth charts, causing needless distress to the parents, causing social service involvement, causing a lot of stress and upset and disappointment. Miss C, were you saying that this happened to you as well?
Yes, my last child, she was breastfed, and I think genetically, because my grandmother said my mother was the same way, she didn't gain a lot of weight for the first year. So when I took her into the pediatrician, I think maybe she may have been 3 or 6 months, something like that, and she was only 12 pounds, and they made a big deal, and they got the social worker, and then another doctor said, she's actually on, I guess, the spectrum with the weight that says she's on the lower end. Like they have like, maybe from this pound to that pound. So she just was a small, what you call a skinny baby, but she was always nursing. I gave her baby food at 4 months. And they were, well, give her the whole jar. Like, I am giving her the whole jar. She was always eating, but she just was a slim child. And then my grandmother told me my mother was the same way. Like she didn't gain weight, a lot of weight for her first year. So, but everything is always, policing. Oh, we got to call the social worker. And, that's why a lot of people are starting not to trust hospitals, because I don't fit into your guidelines. I need to be policed.
Well, right. And how many of us knew, I didn't, that these guidelines were based on, number one, a small sample, but formula-fed babies. So how are you going to compare your breastfed baby and their growth to your formula-fed infants? Right? So again, setting up some families for failure or for difference or to be criticized. All right. So in looking at breastfeeding prevalence at 6 weeks postpartum, researchers found that 70% of women who thought their physician favored breastfeeding were still breastfeeding, compared with 54% of those who thought their physician had no preference. Okay, so this is talking about how doctors do influence mothers in terms of whether they breastfeed or not. And so it's important, that doctors and medical professionals are promoting breastfeeding. But in the book, they talked about how most doctors are given at most 1 day of instruction on breastfeeding. And this is at most, okay? Shouldn't the American Academy of Pediatrics be supporting breastfeeding? Shouldn't OBGYNs be taught about breastfeeding in medical school? But they're not. And the primary supporters, financial donors of the American Academy of Pediatrics, is You guessed it, formula companies, right? Isn't that a conflict? What do you think about that? Right. So how can these professionals be promoting breastfeeding when they are getting money and financial support from formula companies that are saying that people should not breastfeed? Right? So this is the big letdown. This is what we're facing. In the chapter Milk Money, the Big Business of Bodies, Breasts, and Babies, Kimberly Seals-Allairs talks about, by the end of World War II, bottle feeding had become the standard method of feeding infants in the US. The goal of the formula industry and its bumper crop of ancillary bottle feeding products is to maximize market size by increasing the number of mothers who buy these products and the length of time they use them. Dangerous sugars, including sucrose, remain in infant formula in the United States, even though it has been banned in Europe. Scientific journals have published ongoing findings linking the consumption of large quantities of sugar and high fructose corn syrup to behavioral disorders such as ADD, anxiety, hyperactivity, and nighttime insomnia. Not to mention our rising obesity crisis in the US. Could this be contributory to it? I would imagine probably. If a high percentage of the actual science favoring breastfeeding is so clear on 8 health indicators for infants and 4 for mothers, why does the science of breastfeeding continue to appear confusing? So why would you think the science of breastfeeding and the benefits appear confusing? It is studied, but who is funding those research studies? Those research studies are funded by Big Pharma and by the formula companies, which are a monopoly, because there are really 2 formula companies, 2 conglomerates that make pretty much all of the formula, right? So there's very little regulation, and there's no lack of money. And so this money is what is, you know, fueling this science. And she talks about the pseudoscience, the weak science, all of these things in the book. One thing she says in this chapter, which I'm not sure, I've, you know, been, since I read it, I've been kind of pondering on it. She says, because breastfeeding is the biological norm, breastfed babies should not be noted as healthier, but artificially fed babies, so babies fed with formula, should be described as ill, and that they are more often and more seriously ill. So she's saying, instead of us like being surprised and having to promote the benefits of breast milk as being healthier, it should be opposite, so that breast milk should be the standard And we should be talking about how babies that are formula fed are not as healthy, right? Because describing breast milk as healthier then subconsciously makes formula healthy, right? Because then breast milk is healthier. But what she's saying is that formula is not healthy. It is an alternative. It is necessary in some cases, but it is not healthy and desirable for babies. And so it was definitely a change of paradigm for me to think about that. But language is important. We know that. And how we describe things, breastfeeding, formula, bottles, really is important to how we think about them. And so just something for all of us to chew on, how we talk about both of these concepts to our children, to our family members, to our clients, everybody. So the things unseen, what are some of the structural barriers to breastfeeding? What do you think are some of the barriers for breastfeeding? And you guys have mentioned some of it before. What do you think? What stops people from breastfeeding? Let me see in the chat. Erica says being provided with education. Miss C says support. Shamir says lack of proper educators in hospitals. Yes. So let's look at some of these. Free formula from the hospital, right? So right there, we see the advertising and marketing that happens immediately. And what happens when you give free formula in the hospital? What is detrimental about that? Don't we like freebies? What's detrimental? Mixed messages. Okay. And where is a mother most vulnerable in her breastfeeding journey? At the beginning, right? And so here we go. We have free formula. And when you're struggling, just pop open that formula, right? So it is set up that way. Separation from newborn after birth. So how many hospitals unnecessarily separate the newborn from their parent after birth? Do not allow the golden hour, do not allow that bonding right at the beginning, and that easy transition into breastfeeding, okay? Neonate weight loss. So babies are supposed to lose weight after birth. They can lose up to 10 to 12% of their weight in that first week after birth, and then they start gaining, right? But a lot of parents are made to feel guilty, shamed, scared because their baby is losing weight. They're supposed to lose weight. Normal babies will lose weight after birth. They are getting rid of all the amniotic fluid that they have ingested, as well as swelling goes down. So it is completely normal, but parents are made to feel like they are failing, that their breasts are not doing what they're supposed to, when we know that's not true. Baby stomachs are very, very small, and colostrum, a little bit of colostrum is enough to sustain a baby. Nature made it that way, but that's not what parents, especially new parents, are taught. No support from OBGYNs, or pediatricians. And so again, you are having any trouble breastfeeding, latching, your baby is losing weight, and you're told there's something wrong with you, just use formula. Okay, so no actual support. And to be honest, most of these OBGYNs and pediatricians, as we talked about before, have not been taught about breastfeeding, how to breastfeed, how to promote it, why it's important. Okay, this was not deemed important in their education. And then cultural norms. Okay, so in the book, she talks about how there's a long history with, especially with Black families and Indigenous families, where they were used as wet nurses. And there are lots of connotations around breastfeeding that have been passed down generation to generation. And so culturally, there is a lot of discouragement from breastfeeding. This also happens, though, religiously. I know a lot of families that are, for example, Pentecostal, and are told to breastfeed, that bearing your breast and breastfeeding are not desirable, right? It's about modesty, and it's also about, not bearing your breast. And so there are different cultural norms, religious norms that individuals are facing. There's the time commitment, okay? Because breastfeeding does take time, both to learn it, to set up a practice, to get the hang of it. And then at 2 weeks and 6 weeks, and sometimes even more than that, you're going to have cluster feeding right before growth spurts. And so you may be breastfeeding all day, for those time periods. And that leaves very little time for anything else. And, while some women can take the time, can arrange their schedules, can be available to do that, there are many that do not have that available time, okay, because they have to go back to work, because they have other children and no support, because they're expected to do other stuff. And then divvied up care. So in our modern medical system, as she notes in the book, the infant belongs to the pediatrician, their care, the uterus to the obstetrician, and the breast to the lactation consultant. So if you have all of those different professionals and they're not communicating and they're not all trained in the similar way, and none of them are trained about breastfeeding except the lactation consultant, then you're going to have a problem, right? And then social media horror stories. So all the things we hear about on TikTok, on Instagram, about the challenges of breastfeeding, about breasts that won't work, about all of these things. Babies that died because they did not get breast milk, all the horror stories that you can encounter in social media. And then the lack of meaningful maternity leave. And she talks in there kind of about the history in the US of attempts to rectify this, to give women paid maternity leave, to try to bring us closer to what some European and Scandinavian countries do for their women, babies, and fathers. And we are far from that even now. So I wanted to talk in depth about the structural barriers. So we're going to watch a video, maybe. Let me see if I can make it happen here. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Okay. Alrighty.
Show that takes you on a journey through Black history to expose our contributions, as well as many racial massacres hidden from history. So sit back, free your mind, and follow me on this journey. The harsh reality of the wet nurse. Slave trade brought many advantages to Western societies. The primary duty of a slave was to work on plantations, increasing productivity. Slaves often worked long, tedious hours in the sun with no pay or reward for their hard labor. Their presence made traders and plantation owners more productive and made their living conditions very harsh. In addition to their plantation duties, many female slaves were taken into the homes of their masters to serve their mistresses, cook, clean, and wash for them. If a mistress had too many children, the domestic worker was made to help in caring for the child. After a while, female slaves were made to take the place of low-class women paid to breastfeed babies, a practice known as wet nursing. The practice was an excuse for many white mothers to avoid breastfeeding with hopes of maintaining their stature and avoiding the messy part of motherhood. The act was perceived as self-demeaning, and women who were seen breastfeeding were often thought of as uncultured, poor, and often shunned. Doctors of the time did all they could to prove that breastfeeding was an unhealthy act for women. It is believed that doctors were paid huge sums of money to write such reports. The children of slaves grew healthy, while many white families lost their children to poor health. This made many Westerners force slave mothers to breastfeed their white children so that they could develop better and survive the early months of childhood. Once a slave mother had a child, she was quickly assigned to a white mistress and forced to breastfeed their white baby instead of her own. Young and healthy slave women were also forced to breastfeed white babies after doctors discovered that the continuous sucking of a sexually active female breast could result in lactation. While they breastfed white babies at the expense of theirs, slave mothers tried to keep their children alive by feeding them with concoctions they believed will be suitable substitutes for milk. They also gave cow milk and dirty water, which were not suitable for babies' health. This resulted in the high deaths of babies of slaves throughout the slave trade. Slave mothers often kept the white babies in their homes until the child's family felt it was time to take them back. Since the living conditions of the slaves were not the best, several white babies died. Speculating that slave mothers were killing the babies out of spite, they were later forced to move in with the family where they could be monitored. The few 19th century historians who have discussed enslaved wet nurses like Walter Johnson in River of Dark Dreams downplay the extent to which white women capitalized on black breast milk. The reason for this is because historians have focused their research on elite Southern white women while ignoring how non-elite white women used black wet nurses. By studying wet nurse advertisements in Southern newspapers, it revealed a disturbing story of white women's reliance on the exploitation of black women. Freshness was determined by the age of the enslaved wet nurse's infant. The older their infant, the less valuable her milk. Enslaved wet nurses whose infant died soon after childbirth was extremely valuable. White women appreciated the lack of the extra encumbrance, knowing full well that more time and resources would be spent on their own children. Wet nursing did not end after slavery, and many Southern white women continued to employ black wet nurses until the practice fell out of fashion in the 20th century. Like their slave ancestors, free wet nurses were often kept from their children in addition to being forced to do other household chores, but with a severely unfair wage instead of no pay at all. In the present, only 59% of Black women breastfeed, compared to 79% of white women. Certified nurse and midwife Stephanie Devane Johnson interviewed Black women and found that some reject breastfeeding because of the exploited wet nurses of slavery.
So what did you think of that video? Is it understandable why some of that trauma from that time would be passed down and would affect women and families today, especially Black women, women of color? Yes. It is valuable and, was exploited. And so, we do have older women, our grandmothers, our aunts that are wary about breastfeeding and grew up in traditions where they did not want to be relegated in that role and did not look at breastfeeding as positive. Have any of you had that experience in your family where breastfeeding was not encouraged? So, I mean, in my own family, I have one side of my family that is Black and one that is white. And ironically, both discouraged breastfeeding for different reasons. In my Black family, it just wasn't like we're talking about it. I did have ancestors that were slaves. I did have, oh, hold on just a second. And it just was not something that was encouraged. And then, my white grandmother and great grandmother, for them, it was more of a status symbol. Only when they were growing up, formula, carnation, all of those things were being promoted as positive. Twilight sleep was happening. There was the complete medicalization of birth. And so if you breastfed, you were considered poor. Only poor women that couldn't afford formula would breastfeed. And so, you were looked down upon if you chose breastfeeding. It wasn't understood that it was beneficial for babies. So I think it's funny how, these completely different traditions, yet both discouraged breastfeeding. In the chapter Nipple-omics and the Value of Motherhood, it talks about breastfeeding feeling lonely. So in communal society, it's not a lonely activity, okay? Where you have a lot of breastfeeding mothers, where breastfeeding is more accepted, it is a communal activity. But here in the US, we've been made to hide it behind closed doors, behind screens, covering our babies, or using a pump instead of actually breastfeeding in public. And so it becomes this lonely, extremely isolating experience, which also plays into whether people want to choose to do it. Because if you are struggling with depression, if you are a social creature, if you, that is how you survive, and then that is taken away for large portions of the day, then that does affect your decision, whether you like it, whether you want to continue to breastfeed. The undervaluation of breastfeeding is directly related to the broader undervaluation of motherhood. How do you think motherhood is devalued in the US today? So Miss C says a lot of double talk. Shamir says not being able to make your own decisions regarding your child. Definitely. And in the book, she talks about devaluation literally as value. So in the US, we do not place any value on the work that mothers do. And so it's considered like we don't work. If you're a stay-at-home mom, you are lazy, you don't work. There's more value in someone that goes to a job and does work, even though, study after study have shown that the value of what women do in the home, what they do in breastfeeding is, if you put a price on it, if you put a salary on it, is hundreds of thousands of dollars, is very valuable. But because as a culture, we don't value motherhood, we don't value breastfeeding, then it is thrown away, it's looked down upon, it's not given value. We're not even given maternity leave in order to do it and do it well. And so, these are some of the consequences of devaluation. Shamir says medical and social involvement if it's not aligned with what they feel is best. Exactly. And then, we see as doulas the devaluation of motherhood in birth and how the mother's life isn't even valued lots of time. Definitely her emotional and psychological health is not valued. So, I mean, there's countless examples of how mothers, emotions, their experience, their, even enjoyment of many things involved in pregnancy, birth, and postpartum is completely devalued in the US. Is breastfeeding an empowering act of self-determination, or does being at the whim of a child's demands feel so very 1950s? So instead of the freedom and liberation the feminist movement sought to provide, mothers are more vulnerable, more frustrated, and more overlooked than ever before. So there's a whole chapter called The Feminist Fallacy, where she talks about how feminism had lofty goals, but how they've fallen short, especially in the area of breastfeeding. And so that some of the messages have actually harmed the message of breastfeeding and self-determination, and have, really made it difficult for women to be, full mothers, and not split between work and raising children and breastfeeding. And, you know, whether you agree completely or not, because I do feel like, you know, there is some discounting of the movement of feminism and all that it changed, you know, but I do appreciate her themes around unintended consequences. So, you know, when you are fighting for one thing, you don't always recognize that it can disadvantage something else. And so her argument is that, you know, fighting for freedom and liberation in the feminist movement, the messages were such that it said, you know, that that breastfeeding and choosing to breastfeed and stay at home and provide for your child in that way is not as valuable as pumping and bottle feeding, and therefore being able to work outside the home and feed your children. So we are coming to the end, but really quickly, I wanted to talk about just a few of the other themes in the book that I thought were excellent. So she talks about breast is best, right? Which is that big campaign that most people are familiar with. And she talks about how, yes, breast milk may be best, but breastfeeding amid societal pressures and systemic letdowns is the absolute worst, okay? So while the product, the breast milk, may be biologically and nutritionally best, the way that our system is set up, it is not the best for the mother, and we need to change that. In the chapter, Boob Control, the Sexualization of Breastfeeding, she says women's breasts are exposed everywhere, in television, films, magazines, and constantly in advertising. The hypersexualization of breast has alienated many women and caused some mothers not only to fear breastfeeding in public, but to also rethink breastfeeding altogether. Okay, and so the chapter talks about how, you know, breast and sexualization are used to sell everything, but they're not used to portray women in a positive light and to promote breastfeeding. And actually, it turns some women away from the choice to breastfeed, right? And then at the end of the book, here are the 7 starting points that she talks about where we can start to change this. Policy is paramount. Policies for women, policies for breastfeeding, policies for you know, paid family leave, and actually supporting the family. Science needs to step up. You know, we need more science, but science that is not funded by, you know, big pharma, science that's not funded and influenced by formula companies. Medicine must be separate from industry, okay? Otherwise, we're basically just writing advertising campaigns for industry. Policy is important, but so are people. And so we can't forget that we're talking about real individual mothers, birthing people, and breast or chest feeding people. And, you know, the policies are important, but there are unintended consequences to policies that we also need to recognize. Disrupt the choice narrative and add context. So the choice narrative being the narrative that the feminist movement chose, and choice is important. And in the book, she said, you know, she's not against choice, but choice kind of excluded breastfeeding as an option by making it look like something unattractive. If you were choosing to breastfeed, you were choosing to stay under a patriarchal system, whereas really it's a choice that women should have, and it shouldn't be judged. And then lactating may be biological, but breastfeeding is behavioral. And so we need to be taught, we need to have support, we need to see it in community and in context, right? We need to have help if we're having challenges. So it's biological, but it's not easy. And it's not something that you know how to do just instinctually. And, we need actual support in the hospital. It would be ideal if your OBGYN, your midwife, your nurse, if everybody was familiar with breastfeeding, how to latch, and common challenges. And then sweat the small stuff. So in the small stuff, we're talking about life. We're talking about supporting women. And that is the important things, It may not seem important, but putting that bottle of formula, in a baby's mouth will change their entire life. It's going to change their nutrition, their health, their bond with their parent, all kinds of things that we don't even know yet. And so, it's something that may seem small, but it's really important. And so we are at time, but I hope you enjoyed this book. I'm going to put the poll here. If you haven't read it, I highly encourage you to read it. It was really great. I did get to meet the author recently, and she has a podcast called Birthright that talks about the joy in Black birthing, because a lot of our focus is on the health disparities, but she really wants us also to recognize the joy that's in birthing, particularly Black birthing. And it's a wonderful series. I highly recommend that if you listen to podcasts. And thank you for joining us. We will be having book clubs throughout the summer, and I hope to see you there.